This is Autism 101 for school support staff. Thank you for joining me. First, I want to tell you a little bit about our organization. We support families and schools all across Kentucky. Our goal is to bridge the gap between research and practice. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So here's our goals for the day. At the end of this training, you should be able to identify the components of an autism diagnosis. Also, have an understanding of how that diagnosis can impact student responses to everyday events. Also, I want you to leave with some strategies at the end, some different evidence-based practices that we will discuss later in this training. What is autism? Autism spectrum disorder is a complex disability with a wide range of symptoms and variability in how it affects those diagnosed. This can make it very difficult for school support staff to know how do we get started in supporting these students. So hopefully this training will help walk us through those steps. The next few slides will look at the components of an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. The first things that we look for in an autism diagnosis is continuous impacts in the area of social communication and social interaction. And the key there is the social part. So number one, we look at deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So now you're asking yourself, what does that mean? The key way that I remember that is it's the back and forth piece in conversation. So if you and I are having a conversation and I say, "Hi, how are you?" We have an automatic social response, right? You are probably going to say, "I'm fine, how are you?" Students with autism have to be taught those pieces specifically and may struggle to understand the importance of that back and forth piece of, it could also be in emotions, it could be in sharing a shared interest, lots of different ways. But the key component in the way that I remember that is that it's the back and forth piece in interactions, basically. The other piece that we look at are deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors that we use for social interaction. So if you and I are walking down the street, or I'm walking down the street, I'm in New York, big city, I'm from a small town, right? So I'm from a small town, and from a small town, we wave at everyone. So when I'm walking down the street, I generally wave at everyone, whether they're strangers or not. But if I went to New York and I was walking down the street and I saw someone walking humped over, a flat affect on their face, not a non-happy expression on their face, they're kind of humped over, their body language clearly says, "Don't talk to me." I'm probably going to walk on by, and I would know that I might not say hello to them and expect any kind of response. But for students with autism, they struggle to read body language. They struggle to understand facial expressions and all the other components. A ton of our language and a ton of the way that we communicate with each other is through body language. So this can be a key deficit for our students. I tell teachers and school staff that if you are a person who uses the crazy eye or the teacher face, you know, the look that you give kids when you say, "This is enough, don't do anything else, whatever you're doing, you should stop immediately." The stink eye maybe is an Eastern Kentucky expression. Kids with autism will not know and understand what that means. So you will have to teach that to them explicitly. The other component that we look at is deficits in developing and maintaining and understanding relationships. So being able to make friendships and keep friendships. Think about your own friend circle. It's tough to maintain a friendship, especially in the times that we're in right now, but it's tough to kind of maintain and develop friendships. So this is a big struggle for students with autism. The The next components that we look for are restrictive repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. And you have to show it with at least 2 of the following items. So number 1, stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. So this is things like hand flapping, lining up your toys, having to have, I play with Hot Wheels, but the only thing that I do with them is I line them up primarily. Repeating specific parts of someone else's speech. So it could be repeating a cartoon that you hear over and over. The next part is number 2, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So transitioning, being stuck in the same routine. Today there is picture day, and so we can't go to gym. And for most kids, this would be a disappointment, but for a child with autism, this might cause a meltdown in behavior. It could cause some aggression, or they become just so drastically upset that it ruins their day because they're so stuck in that same routine every day. It could also be, I eat what I eat. I only eat pickles and potato wedges, and I can't change to eat anything else because this is what I eat. I eat the same thing every day for lunch for the last 3 years. And it might not be that extreme, but just some examples of it. So highly fixated, restricted interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. This is a tough one because one man's fixation is another person's hobby, right? But for these kiddos, it may be that they know everything that there is to know about dinosaurs, but getting them to change from that topic. If they were having a conversation with others, they might not be able to carry on a conversation about anything except for dinosaurs. For some kids, this could be, I've had kiddos who were so fixated on spinning things. They could make anything spin, a ball, car wheels, anything that they could get spin. They would become really intensely focused on that to the point that they cut out everything else because they so needed to spin objects. Number 4 is hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspect. So things are too hot, too cold, light touch might be painful, so abnormal reactions to what would be considered normal sensory input. So what does this look like in the school setting? So going into the cafeteria, it could be very loud, kids who have their hands over their ears in response to loud noises, kids who have a hard time smelling the different smells that you might come across in a kitchen or even in a classroom. Someone's perfume might cause some pretty significant sensory input. And the sensory piece is something that was newly added in 2013. I guess we can't say newly added anymore at this point, but it was a new piece that was just added into the autism diagnosis. Most recently was the sensory aspect of that. Kids who take off their shoes. I can't wear shirts that have buttons because I don't like the texture of that. Kids who might chew on their shirt. It could be in that they're sensory seeking. Instead of sensory avoiding, they're sensory seeking kids. So I'm seeking out lots of sensory stimuli. Everything goes into my mouth, or I need to touch things, and that causes difficulties in their school day. The next component of an autism diagnosis we will look at are the levels of severity. So level 3, requiring very substantial support. I think of a level 3 as what I would call classic autism. This student is going to need significant support. They may have very limited ability to initiate conversation, or they may have very limited verbal skills. Please remember that verbal skills do not always equal an IQ score, meaning that just because a student is nonverbal does not mean that they don't have a very big capacity to learn and grow. A student who is considered a level 3 autism, I would expect to see a significant amount of rigidity. So they're going to be very inflexible when it comes to their schedule. They may have big challenges in coping skills. That's something that hopefully they're going to be learning at school. Those are kind of the general things that I would expect to see. So a level 2, a student who requires substantial support. This is obviously the student who falls somewhere in the middle. They probably have better verbal skills. They probably may have some skills in initiating conversations and maintaining them, but they're still going to need significant support. They're still going to be a student who is going to need support in the school setting for sure. They may, I would say that this would probably still be obvious to the casual observer. They're going to still struggle enough that you're going to pick up on that they probably have autism. So a student who has level 1 autism requiring support, those are the students that I would consider they frequently fall into the category of people don't think they have autism, right? They function well enough. They probably have pretty good verbal skills, but they really struggle in the area of socialization and friendships and maintaining things. So at school, working in a group is going to be a big challenge for them. And most of these students, a level 1 student, should be out in the regular classroom, primarily should be the place that they are receiving services. They're going to spend most of their day with their same age peers, hopefully. We would have previously used words like Asperger's syndrome. So if you're thinking a student with Asperger's, I would say that probably falls a level 1 or maybe a level 2. Those words kind of went away when we switched over to the autism spectrum disorder. So let's talk demographics. We know that autism knows no racial, ethnic, or social boundaries. You are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism if you are a boy versus a girl. And we'll talk more about what the current statistics are in just a few minutes. There are varying degrees of severity in different individuals. Autism can look very different across kids. So we always say if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. And I think that's what makes it such a challenge for school staff, in that last year I had a student with autism and I learned some great strategies and I put those in place for my student, and this year I have a different student with autism and those strategies are not as effective. They don't work as well for the next kid. So that's the goal today, is to give you tools in your toolbox. So I want to talk about what autism is not. Autism is not the result of bad parenting. I think sometimes as school staff, it's easy to say, if his parents would just spank him, we could fix this in a minute. But unfortunately, that generally does not cure autism. It's not children who just choose not to behave. And just because you have an autism diagnosis does not mean that you will have behavioral challenges. And we know that autism is not the same in every child. Every child, it affects them differently. And this is part of the challenge of learning and working with students with autism. The Centers for Disease Control released the most updated information on the prevalence rate of autism. These numbers are based on information from the 2016 survey from the Centers for Disease Control. This data comes from information from 11 states across the United States. And what they do is they contact doctors' offices that are a part of their network and look at the rates of children who are 8 and 4 years old and see who is identified as having autism at that point. So what we know is currently is that boys and girls together, the rate of an autism diagnosis is 1 in 54 children. Now, if you are a boy, then 1 in 34 boys are identified as having autism. And if you're a girl, the current rate is 1 in 144 girls. Now, we know that there is probably some disparity and that autism in girls looks very different. And so that is part of the reason, anyways, why girls are diagnosed possibly at a less rate. The numbers have been steadily increasing over the last several years, and there's a lot of information and a lot of reasons why that could be. It could be that we do a better job of diagnosing children with autism. Also, we're keeping better information at this point, and we've also, some of the other causes could be that we've brought in. We went from an autism diagnosis to autism spectrum disorder, and we've kind of rolled in some of that information into the same category. So there's several reasons as to why that could be a rate increase. What causes autism? This is a question that I get asked frequently, and unfortunately, we don't exactly know. There are a lot of theories, and a lot of people have different opinions. Here are the pieces that I can tell you that we do know, is that I believe there is a genetic component in some families specifically. In my family, we have a high rate of autism, and I do think that it goes back to some genetic components. Lots of people have a lot of different theories and have a lot of different beliefs about what causes autism, but unfortunately, at this time, I think there's not a good, honest answer as to what exactly causes autism. So I tell people that we need to focus on what can we do for students who do have autism. How do we treat them? How do we make sure that they get the best access that they can to education possible? Something else that I feel like it's important for you to know about is that the associated medical conditions that sometimes comes along for the ride when you have a child or a student who has an autism diagnosis. So we know that things like seizure disorder comes at a higher rate for students with autism. So gastrointestinal disorders, so stomach issues, stomach pain, also things like celiac disease, which can cause gluten intolerance, chronic constipation. Kids don't always feel well, and I think that sometimes we neglect to take these kinds of considerations into thought when we are working with a student with autism. Other things are high rates of allergies. Sleep dysfunction can be an important thing to know. Does your student that you're working with struggle with sleep dysfunction? So they may not sleep at night. They may only sleep a few hours, or they may be someone who wakes up every few hours and is up and down the whole night. Pain tolerances for some students with autism, they may not feel pain, or they may over feel pain. They have sensory dysfunction, and so it affects the way that they experience pain. Pica is an eating disorder, meaning that you eat non-food items. It can be lots of different things. I have a friend whose daughter ate a rock. They made prayer rocks at Sunday school, and she ate the rock, unfortunately, and had to have stomach surgery. So knowing whether or not your student has pica and is prone to eat inanimate objects can be very important. Those are great information and things that you need to know if you are working with, or if you have a student with autism in your classroom setting, or on your school bus, or in the cafeteria. Those are all things that you would need to know. How autism affects an individual can be very difficult to understand. We know that sometimes a student with autism has really big strengths in a specific area. They do great in reading, a very strong area in reading for them, but in math they struggle. Or they're very verbal, they have great verbal skills, so they can say all kinds of words, but they can't always say the words that they need. So they can't say the words that come into social interactions. Those words are a challenge, or understanding the context of those words can be a big challenge for those kids. So I just want us to keep that in mind as we go throughout this, is that the way that autism affects each individual child can be very different, and it makes it hard to see the autism, and sometimes it makes it hard to see the child. And remember that we're talking about kids here, kids who have good days and bad days. The other piece to keep in mind is that since we don't always recognize or understand the symptomology that comes along with autism, we don't always provide appropriate accommodations, and that can present a big challenge for our students. Is recognizing and understanding that yes, this is a symptom of autism and this is a part of their autism diagnosis, and so we need to provide appropriate accommodations whenever possible. And the other part that comes into play here is that sometimes students with autism can hide some of their challenges, especially girls. Some of the research is saying is that this looks very different in girls, and it can also look very different in boys. But we talk with parents, and parents will say, you know what, they do fine at school, but when at the end of the day, when they get home, we're getting emotional meltdowns. Kids are drastically upset. They've had anxiety all day, and then it becomes a problem either at the end of the school day or when they arrive home. So that's just something to keep in mind. This is just a good place to talk about remembering if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. In the next part of this training, we're going to talk about strengths and weaknesses, and then we're going to address supports and evidence-based practices that we can use. But just know that just every child's strengths and weaknesses will be different, and that's great. But it makes it more of a challenge as the support person for them. So I wanted us to start thinking about strengths for students with autism, because sometimes I think we get so caught up in all of the challenges that they sometimes face that we forget that they frequently have some really good strengths. Things along the line of a really strong memory, very much a rule follower, and so if I can teach you the classroom rules, or I can teach you the rules of the cafeteria or the playground, then they are going to stick with following those rules. Honesty, sometimes it's brutal honesty because they don't always understand the little white social lies that we all tell each other. Thinking in pictures, if you've heard of Temple Grandin, she talks about how if you can make things visual, and she sees things in pictures when she thinks about it, very visually oriented. So visual supports are a good thing to know about. See the world in a different way. I read, and I can't remember the name of the book, but there is an article that talks about living with autism is like being a Mac computer in a Windows world, right? So they just see the world in a little bit of a different way, which doesn't make it wrong. It sometimes is a very good thing. I've met kiddos with autism who have great creative thinking skills. They think way outside of the box. Things I don't see or I would not have thought of. They are able to pick up on those and take those things and run with them. Attention to details, they are very detail oriented. They're going to pick up on the microscopic items. So just some strengths to think about for our students with autism. And remember, they're kids, right? So they're kids, and everyone that you meet may have different strengths and different weaknesses, and that just comes along with being human. So what characteristics cause our students to have difficulties in school? So working memory, simply described, is the ability to hold information in your brain. It's kind of like a sticky note for your brain. It keeps the most important information, or it keeps whatever you're thinking about at that time. It holds it in your brain. So kids with autism struggle sometimes with working memory issues. Executive functioning skills. These are kind of a bigger thing that you hear about now, but what executive functioning skills is, it's a set of cognitive skills that allow us to plan, focus attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks at the same time. So it's kind of like the filing cabinet in your brain, right? So I have a big filing cabinet, and executive functioning skills help me to find and retrieve the information that I need, and then to get started using that information. So kids with autism frequently struggle with executive functioning skills. Low self-esteem, not able to self-monitor, so they are not able to regulate their own emotions at times. So emotional regulations is a big struggle. And they don't always read social cues and understand their like peer interactions and teacher interactions. So things like answering questions, working in a group is a big struggle sometimes for our kiddos with autism. Knowing to take turns and raise your hand, all of those are struggles that our students with autism may have in a school setting. Challenges in social interactions is one of the key features for students with autism. So, students with autism may laugh or smile at the wrong times. So, if I'm in trouble, my face may not match the situation. They sometimes struggle with knowing, when do I laugh, when do I cry. It comes back to some of the emotional regulation piece, and also understanding and reading other people's body languages. So they may not respond when their name is called. Knowing that if I say, Johnny, come here, they may not know to come at that point. They may not respond when you just say their name. So if you think about that in a social interaction, we go up and say, Kim. But if I don't look at you at that point, as other children may walk away and not continue the social interaction. Other social interaction challenges, sharing interest with other students. Sometimes kids with autism have a very narrow focus of things that they're interested in. I worked with a really interesting student who loved dead languages. He spent a lot of time learning Greek and Latin on his own, and he was very fabulous at it. And he came in from recess one day at school and told me, Miss Kim, no one will play with me. No one will talk to me on the playground. And so social skills was a big part of what we were working on for the students. So I went out for a few days in a row to observe what was happening so that we could figure out how to best to support this child. And when I went out to the playground, what was happening was that he wanted to tell the other kids the Latin names of the rocks and the sticks and the flowers that were on the playground. And he didn't know how to play, right? He did not know how to play with them appropriately on the playground. So we set some goals and switched around some of the options that we were working on for him to help him develop social skills appropriate for the playground. And also gave him an opportunity to share what he knew during a more appropriate time. So, challenges in communication. Communication can be a major challenge for students with autism. And we're talking about autism spectrum disorder. So communication challenges could mean everything from a student who is nonverbal and doesn't speak at all, but maybe they communicate through some kind of device or through sign language or through like a PECS, picture exchange communication type system, or some sort of picture system. It could be all the way up to students who are very, very verbal, but they struggle in the back and forth part of conversation. So they're willing to talk, but they only want to talk about roller coasters because roller coasters is their high interest, super high interest that they have. So if they're having a conversation with you, you might be talking about schoolwork, but they're going to bring it back to roller coasters because that's what they want to talk about. And that's their high super interest. So they really can almost bring any conversation back to that piece. They may struggle with reading body language. A lot of our communication as humans comes down to nonverbal language. So we're reading people's faces and we're reading the tone of their body posture. If someone's standing forward and facing you and their body is kind of open, then you know that they're interested in the conversation that you're having. But students with autism may not read when they don't read your body language always, and this can cause a lot of confusion for everyone. They may blurt out. Blurting can be a major issue sometimes. And they may always tell the truth, which sounds like a good thing, but when you think about how many times we tell social lies, I had a child I had a child tell someone that they asked, how does this shirt make me look fat? And the child said, that shirt, you look like two sausages in one casing. Um, because that was their truth. Whereas I would have said, no, this shirt doesn't make you look fat. Because that's the social lie, right? That we always tell. So it can definitely be some challenges in the area of communication. Um, can be a big struggle. You may also get students who have echolalia. So this means that they may repeat your words, or they may be repeating phrases out of a cartoon or a movie that they watched. And they do have verbal language, but they may not have good communication skills. And the other challenges that we face sometimes for our students with autism is that our very high functioning students who have really good verbal skills may still have communication challenges that are unmet, and we don't realize it because they're so very verbal that we think that they have great communication skills, where they may struggle with the part of the social communication piece in this. They may struggle with the social language that comes along with communication. So challenges and behaviors. And I want to start this slide by saying that not every child with autism will have behavior difficulties, but I have seen a lot of children with autism who have struggled with behavioral challenges. A lot of times it comes back to issues with the routine. They can be very routine oriented, and so getting them to change their routine, or if unexpected things happen, so there's a fire alarm and we can't go to gym right now, or it's picture day and you can't get access to their normal schedule because everyone's schedule has changed. It can be very upsetting for students with autism. We also get into things like ritualized behavior. So I had a student who had to tap 3 times on the door before he entered into the classroom. It drove his regular ed teacher crazy because she didn't like the tapping sound, but it was his ritualized behavior, and we just had, in that instance, we just had to adjust to it a bit. Eventually we shaped that into he tapped on his leg 3 times versus the door. Other things can come into behavioral challenges like sensory overload or even just sensory issues. I've had too much sensory stimuli. They may hear things that other people don't necessarily hear. So they're hearing the tapping in the pipes in an old building that everyone else can ignore, but they may struggle to block those things out. And we have students who get into meltdowns. They just cannot move on there, and meltdowns look like a lot of things, right? If you've worked with a student with autism, I probably don't need to go into a big description, but any kind of a meltdown, so crying, screaming, any of those kinds of things. And we may see things like just I can't move on in my routine, struggling with transition. I can't move on to the next item because I don't feel completely finished with this one. So in the next slides, we're going to start looking at ways to address these needs. So in this section, we're going to talk about evidence-based practices. And we're also going to start going through some strategies that you can put into place right away in whatever setting you're in. So these evidence-based practices come from the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. This report was just released this past spring in 2020. So currently there are around 28 evidence-based practices. I'm not going to read this chart to you, so you can hit pause and read all of them to yourself, but I do want to kind of talk you through how you would use this chart. So you can see here on the left side of your screen are a list of evidence-based practices. And then across the top, it has sort of categories of the areas that these are useful in. So we see pre-academic skills. Going across the top, we see adaptive self-help, behavior, cognitive, communication, joint attention, and it continues on for several different categories, all the way through down to vocational. And then you see these in the next box down, you see an age group. And I'm going to say the yellow area is 0 to 5. The next area is ages 6 to 14, and that area is blue, and 15 to 22 is the last box in each of those categories, and it is the green box, right? Just in case you can't read those. I know this visual is just a bit blurry. So we are going to talk about, in the rest of this PowerPoint, we are going to talk about antecedent-based intervention, which is on this sheet. We are going to talk about visual supports, behavior momentum, and reinforcement. And all of these evidence-based practices have just been some of them are recategorized, meaning that this may look a little bit different. If you've looked at the old evidence-based practice matrix, it has changed pretty significantly, I feel like. So just something to be aware of. This is a great place to come if you are working with a student with autism and you are trying to figure out how to get started. So if I was working with a student with autism and I had behavioral concerns, I could come over here to the category that says behavior, and my student is age 8, then that falls in that 6 to 14 category. So I know if I look down this list of blue, all of these that are shaded in blue are research-based, evidence-based practices. So there is research to back up that these are effective for children with autism in the age range of 6 to 14. So just an example of how you might use that. So I also want to mention all of these different websites. I'm going to try to put them in the link session on the module so that you can actually link to them from there. So Autism Internet modules and the Affirm modules, both are places that you can go. All of these are places that you could go to get more information. So when you leave this training, you'll probably have more questions than answer. And so we're aware of that. So I just wanted you to have resources that you could find later that you could come back to for additional professional development information. So these are some great places that you can go, and all of them are free. So I will put the links to these in the module itself.